Hey everyone. So we'll talk a bit about fermentation, which is really fun and in many ways maybe the heart of making whiskey. To this point, we've basically undergone a similar process as you would with making beer, and by the end similar, but without hops and using different grains as well. But so fermentation. So what we have. So following my last video on grains, you have wort, which is this sweet, grainy liquid. And so the next phase of the process is you want that sugar to be converted to alcohol. And so this happens in fermentation. And what fermentation is you take this sugary liquid, you add yeast to it. As soon as you add yeast to it, the yeast starts to eat up the sugar, and it creates alcohol and carbon dioxide as well. And so if you ever see a big fermenting vessel in a distillery or a brewery, it's bubbling right up all over, but it's not boiling. That's just the carbon dioxide being released through the action of the yeast. So that in itself would be very simple. It's a very complex process, everything that's going on in fermentation. And it's one of the major areas where flavor is created. And it's significantly underrated, I would say, in terms of how distilleries tend to talk about where the flavor comes from in a whiskey. So if you're familiar with beer, or if you've ever made beer, the yeast you use can dramatically change the flavor of the product you get in the end. So the type of yeast you use, how you ferment it, will hugely influence the character of your whiskey. And this is where, probably the most flavor generation happens at this stage. And over the course of a few days, this sugary, grainy liquid is transformed into this really complex beer. It's called a distiller's beer. Usually around 10%, 10 to 15% alcohol at the end. That's just full of flavor. And it's not made to be consumed at that point, because it's going to be distilled and further refined. So you can actually, the creation of certain flavors like, sulfury flavors may not be desirable in a beer, even though beers have some, but you want to kind of generate as much flavor as you can, and then in the next step distillation allows you to strip things out and pull out what you want from this step. Another quick note on fermentation, you can keep fermenting. So once you've added yeast to your liquid, it'll start to ferment, and after a few days you'll get basically all the sugar converted into alcohol. As you keep if you keep the liquid there, you start to continue to generate flavor, and that happens because there's bacteria and other organisms that are actually working with the liquid as well, so to speak. They continue to generate those flavors. So often carefully managed fermentations can go longer and actually generate even more flavor, but it really depends what you're looking for. But that's fermentation in a nutshell. So it's another area where your selection of yeast and also how you ferment, so how long, what temperatures you ferment at will change what the yeast will produce and the other microorganisms will produce. And then I guess what your spirit is as well, or the grain you're using will really influence flavor. And in Canada, we'll use different yeasts as well. So a single distillery may use multiple yeasts. And usually distilleries are focused on kind of some lighter styles, which would be the base whiskey that other things would be blended into. And then you'd have your flavoring whiskey, which I'll talk about more in the blending section, which would be really targeted to be these really flavorful whiskeys. And if you start to think, what they're building for, those flavoring whiskeys, the ones they want to be kind of packed with as much flavor as possible, so they can go as far as they can when they're blended in small amounts to other things. You want those flavoring whiskeys. You want the flavor to be maximized, and so often special yeasts are used. They may ferment them longer. If you ever happen to be at a distillery where you can taste, say, a corn mash, or as they're a corn beer, I guess, it kind of tastes like alcoholic cornflakes. If you then taste a rye whiskey that they're making to flavor their blends, incredibly complex. It'd be really fruity, spicy, floral, astringent, sharp, just like packed full of flavor, and that's intentional. So at this point, we have made ourselves an alcoholic liquid of about 10 to 15% alcohol, and we're ready to distill it. And I'll talk about that in the next video.